Thank you so much, Bern, for facilitating that standing ovation. I really appreciate that. I have a lot of information about marijuana, and not all of it is included in this address here today. There's way too much. So if you want more information, just feel free to grab me sometime during the conference afterwards, and I'll be happy to help you get any information you want to know. I've really focused this towards campus communities and young adults in the college age group. But there's a lot more out there, particularly around younger adults in their teens and so forth. I'm going to, let's see, start with, you've heard about me. I will tell you that we are one of those local jurisdictions in Colorado that did choose to legalize medical and recreational marijuana. It is a choice in Colorado whether or not you legalize in your local jurisdiction. Our first retail marijuana dispensary opened on February 18th of 2014, and so we've been living with it since it was legalized in 2012 and all of the prep work that went up to implementation. Some abbreviations that you will see me use in my presentation, just in case you're not accustomed to seeing MMJ or RMJ, and an overview of what we'll be discussing. I do have a lot of slides. I'm going to skip through some of them. I was supposed to be co-presenting with Dr. Don Mish, who's the head of our Wardenburg Health Center on the CU Boulder campus. I've integrated some of his slides into the presentation so you have some of his information, but I may not spend time on them. But they will be posted to the website for the conference, so you will have all of the information even if I don't spend a lot of time or any time on that particular slide. All right, I'm going to start out with a brief history of marijuana legalization because I think there's a couple of pieces I want to emphasize here. So marijuana wasn't always illegal, but it did become illegal in 1937. Oregon was the first state to decriminalize it, and I'll talk about decriminalization versus legalization in a minute, but it is still criminalized in approximately 20 states. That means there is the risk that you could go to jail. That's what criminalization means. It doesn't mean a lot of jail necessarily, but there is still that risk. The first state to legalize medical marijuana was California in 1996, and now we have 38 states with some form of legal medical marijuana. A few of them have voted to legalize but haven't actually implemented yet, but I've included them in that count. In 2009, there was something called the Ogden Memo put out by the federal government, which basically indicated that they weren't going to go after people who were operating under the legal framework in their state. And that was a big shifting point for some of what happened in the marijuana community. And then 2012, first states to legalize marijuana for recreational use, with some other jurisdictions that have followed since then, and more perhaps on the way. Do you know, has Ohio gotten the number of signatures that they need yet? I heard they were deficient. Sounds like it. Okay. I'm sorry. Well, and part of the reason I'm sorry is because the way that they're doing it is this whole cartel kind of piece. It just doesn't seem like good policy. So here's a map of marijuana legalization status. The different colors have different meanings. I encourage you to go to Wikimedia if you want the most updated version. But suffice it to say that this is a trend. This is, it's happening, it's becoming more and more legal in some form or another across our country. So I want to spend a little bit of time on decriminalization. A big part of the campaign in some places to legalize marijuana is to get people out of prisons, and all these people who are serving these very lengthy sentences for marijuana convictions. If that is your goal, you can accomplish that through decriminalization. You don't have to legalize the use of marijuana to accomplish that goal. In many states where it's decriminalized, and this is the way it was in Colorado before it was legalized, it was a petty offense with a maximum penalty of a $100 fine. Nobody could be sentenced to jail. Nobody had a a career-damaging conviction on their record. So if you want to accomplish that, there's a way to do that without making it legal. So you can see there what the intent behind decriminalization is. It also makes it a really low enforcement priority. Legalization is completely different. The intent is to regulate it like you do alcohol. The intent is to collect taxes. The intent is to eliminate the black market, although that hasn't been so successful in Colorado. And the intent is not have any type of a legal response, even a low fine, to people within that, using within that limit. So really two fundamentally different purposes. All right, so here's the history in Colorado. In 2000, they legalized medical marijuana on a small scale. That did not create a huge shift in our environment in Colorado. There were no dispensaries where you could go and buy it. It was either grown by the patients themselves or by caregivers. So things went on without really a big change in the situation until 2009. And that's when the Ogden memo came out from the federal government and their position softened. The caregiver rule was overturned, and you start seeing the appearance of legal medical marijuana dispensaries. And you can see that all of a sudden you have a huge increase in the number of medical marijuana patients beginning then. 2010 is really our turning point. It's not 2012 with legalization. It's not 2014 with implementation. It is 2010, because at that point the state legislature legalizes medical marijuana businesses, and what is now known as the era of medical or of marijuana commercialization begins. And a number of the slides that I have up here from the state of Colorado sources mark off time frames in that way: pre-2000, 2000 to 2009, 2010 to 2013, which is commercialization, and 2014, which is implementation of legalized recreational marijuana. As of the end of 2014, you can see we had over 800 marijuana centers in our state where you could legally go and buy it. All right, so marijuana is really fundamentally different today, at least in Colorado, than what people grew up understanding marijuana to be in the 60s and 70s. I know all of you know about the two different forms of marijuana, one high in THC, one high in CBD, and these are the effects imputed to them and why people use that. What's interesting is that many of the states that have legalized medical marijuana have legalized both types of marijuana, even though purportedly it's the CBD in the marijuana that has the therapeutic medical effect. So, and many of the medical marijuana patients are buying the high THC marijuana and not the high CBD marijuana. So if you are not yet at the point of implementing any kind of legal marijuana, that's something to think about from a policy standpoint. So as I said, this is not the marijuana of the 70s. And I think when people in Colorado voted for legal marijuana, I think many of them really thought that that's what they were legalizing, was the type that was used in the 70s. But I'm sure many of you have probably seen this slide before. The THC content in marijuana has increased dramatically. This is the University of Mississippi's Potency Monitoring Project. So you've seen a huge increase in the amount of THC in samples seized by law enforcement from back in 1972 up to the present. The average THC content of leaf marijuana being sold in marijuana is 18.7% in Colorado. So it's even higher than what you see here on this graph. Top shelf strains of leaf marijuana go as high as 30%, and this is a result of product engineering in a legal environment. This is deliberate. And in some of the other forms of marijuana have even higher THC contents. So as I said, they are cultivating it to be higher THC content. Hash oil, which is a very common form of ingesting marijuana now because you can use that in an e-cigarette or vaping, is 15 to 50%. And then some of the hash oil extracts, wax, shatter, dab. You become familiar with all this new terminology if you weren't already. Gets very high, up to 90% in the cases of some, which is just incredibly high. So the way it's being consumed, probably not that different from how it's being consumed in other states in a lot of ways. So smoking it is still the most common way. The biggest growth area, if you will, has been in vaping. So you can buy a device that's very much like an e-cigarette, only you're filling it with your hash oil instead of there being liquid nicotine. There's also dabbing, and this is, as it's explained there, it's also inhaled, but this is where you're having your up to 90% concentrate THC, and they're inhaling it as they've heated it. The vaping is really the one that you will see, that we've seen very broadly. Friends of mine who go out at night a lot more than I do tell me that until Boulder cracked down on vaping, they were seeing it in about a third of the people going to restaurants, bars, concerts at night. Because in those environments, e-cigarettes were legal, and so people would bring in their marijuana in their vaping device, and nobody could really tell the difference between whether they were using tobacco or marijuana. Our city council eventually addressed that by changing our definition of smoking to include e-cigarettes. So now e-cigarettes of any type cannot be used in those public spaces, but that was a loophole for a while, and unless you change your definitions around smoking, that's something that you're likely to see. Edibles are huge in in Colorado. That means they have baked goods, candies, drinks, anything that you can think that you could put marijuana in, it goes into. And these are some of the examples. This picture on the lower right-hand corner, this is modern packaging that started early this year. Up until then, what you were looking at looked like actual cookies and candies, and it was very easy to mistake marijuana-infused baked goods for ones that were not. So the other thing that happens when you enact legal marijuana is you start changing your normative environment. And I think not all of us understood the ways in which this might occur, but I can share some of this with you at this point. And it starts out with medical marijuana. And when you start seeing medical marijuana dispensaries around and you hear of people using medical marijuana, that starts normalizing the behavior of using marijuana at all. And so this is the sort of universal symbol for medical marijuana. If any of you have spent any time in Central and South America, the green cross are the pharmacies down there. So it just really, really irritates me that that's what they've co-opted, but that's what they've done in the industry. And the interesting thing, though, is that if medical marijuana is successful, there aren't horrible stories about overdoses or people using it accidentally or whatever, then all of a sudden recreational marijuana does not become so scary. So what would you rather your marijuana retailer look like? Maybe some of you have seen the photo up there on the top. That's from medical marijuana in Southern California, Venice Beach, I believe. They obviously don't have regulation around signage and presentation. Here on the lower photo is one of our good operators in the city of Boulder. They do not have a single marijuana leaf. They do not even have a green cross, although they're retail, not recreational, but I mean not medical, but still some of those places do use the green cross. So it's pretty obscure. You have to know that it's a marijuana dispensary. Coincidentally, this is the one that's closest to our college campus. It's right on the edge, 1,000 feet, which is the limitation. Very busy on Thursday, Friday, Saturday afternoons. All right, the number and density of marijuana outlets is going to influence your social norms. So this is a Google map of the city of Boulder. The green dots and the one yellow dot represent where our retail marijuana outlets are. As of last count, we had 15 recreational outlets, and 12 medical outlets. And this is something that you can control through your local regulation if you choose to do so. By contrast, this is the city of Denver. This area down at the bottom where you see a whole bunch of green dots in a line, that has come to be called the Green Mile. And they actually, the marijuana retailers down there wanted to co-opt that name and advertise and brand it. And historically, it's been an area where there were a lot of antique shops and consignment clothing stores and secondhand clothing stores and stuff like that. And they are not happy with the idea of rebranding. So they've been able to defeat that. But nevertheless, if you think about what the exterior of your outlet might look like, and then you think of them in that level of concentration, you can imagine how that starts changing, again, your normative environment. So there are approximately 100 in Denver. Does anybody want to make a guess as to how many McDonald's there are in that same area? 31. Anybody want to guess how many Starbucks? About 50. So this is way more common and prevalent than even McDonald's or Starbucks. All right, how they present externally will also influence social norms. Up in the corner there with the rainbow, that's the farm. That is one of our other very responsible operators in Boulder. Again, on the outside, they don't have anything that visibly telegraphs that it's a marijuana outlet. Even this one down here in the corner with the yellow plants, that's a medical outlet, but it's fairly discreet. On the other hand, you have the lighted sign, mix and match ounces, $220. That's at a key intersection in the city of Boulder. And this other one with the marijuana leaves and the big cannabis sign, that's in a mountain community. So again, you can influence how it appears in your community through your local regulations, but if you don't regulate, it's sort of like First Amendment. All right, and then again, advertising and promotion, how that occurs is going to influence your social norms. These are medical marijuana ads in California. I probably don't really need to say much. Does this really look like they're advertising Tylenol or a Tylenol replacement? Looks a lot more like alcohol advertising to me, but this is what you can expect that you might encounter. All right, even public education campaigns can influence social norms. And I'm going to go through these a little bit quickly just because, again, they are on your materials and I do want to save time for questions. But as a backdrop, our State Department of Public Health, in response to the fact that we have legalized marijuana, decided to do a health promotion campaign, which was very important. And it's to help educate people about what the laws are because not everybody knows exactly what they are, especially if you're traveling in our state. So this campaign is in the form of billboards, it's on bus ads, it will show up on the internet. So it was important to do that, but at the same time, the constant exposure to these things, this will also have you start accepting that this is normative behavior. So it's the Good to Know campaign, and they have a Good to Know website if you want to check it out. There are all these beautiful pictures. I love the pictures. Many of them have these kind of rhymes. I find them to be sort of Dr. Seuss-like. For those underage, it's just not okay. Their brains are still growing, so keep it away. So, I feel really conflicted about this. On the one hand, I'm really happy that they're doing this messaging, and it's good for people to know how bad it is, particularly for that younger adult population. And at the same time, how many other states do you go to where they're doing this kind of a campaign? And maybe they should be, but maybe they're afraid of normalizing it as well. Here's another one. Don't drive high. The other interesting thing about this is, to me, the graphics feel very similar to children's books and the illustrations that you see there. And again, I think it's meant to keep this kind of low key and benign. And so I really appreciate that they're educating so people aren't going to be using marijuana in public, for instance, that you shouldn't take it out of state. What the limitations are on consumption or possession, including, these are the things that aren't actually part of the campaign, but these are another part of our regulation, is the number of plants you can have per household. And suggestion that you keep it locked up. All right, so what have we seen in terms of use and attitudes towards marijuana in a legal environment? Talk about adults first. Adults meaning age 18 to 25. In a legal marijuana environment, you may see more adults using marijuana. Different sources report differing numbers. This is obviously the NSDUH. We have another source, the Influential Factors in Healthy Living survey that was done in March of 2014. That reported that Colorado's past month use for adults was at 21.2%, which is much higher than the 12.8% that you see depicted here. So we're really not sure. Different surveys will show different things, but certainly it's higher than what you're seeing in the rest of the US, and we were probably there already, but we think it's probably increased. Of the people who are using monthly, you may see an increase in the frequency of use. Seems, those are some pretty high numbers. All right, use by adolescents. So past 30-day use. National average 15.6%, Colorado 19.7%, so already higher. And then in the Denver metro area, a whopping 26.2%. And that's also in an environment, you remember that map with all the green dots. Well, if you take the entire Denver metro area, not just the city of Denver, 213 outlets in that area. So a pretty high correlation between availability and use. And I don't have this slide in my presentation, but they've surveyed kids to find out where they are getting their marijuana, and there was a huge diversion even before legal recreational marijuana from the medical marijuana to kids. And that was also bred to be very high in THC, much of it, not all of it. And so they are getting that higher THC marijuana and not just the sort of ditchweed that they had access to before. Also a big change in perception of harm from regular marijuana smoking. This is national data. This is not just Colorado. This is the entire country. You can see there's a huge shift after some big, our sort of acme in 1990. There's much less perception of any harm. And these 12th graders, of course, are then your college students in the next year or two to come. To me, this is particularly concerning when you think about the fact that if you overlaid this with the graph showing the percent THC in marijuana, so the risk of harm, perception of harm is going way down, the amount of THC is going up. It's really a very unfortunate juxtaposition. Okay, so the age group that most of you are working with, 18 to 25-year-olds, average past month marijuana use compared to the national average from 2006 up until 2013, which is the last year we have data for. Back in 2006, we were 8th in the country, so we were never really low down there on the bottom. Marijuana commercialization, remember, starts in 2010. And you see that jump there. And in 2013, we were 2nd in the nation for average past month use by this age population. That doesn't necessarily mean that the fact that we have legal marijuana has caused that, but there's certainly an association. That's concerning. This is college student data. This was compiled by Don Mish so that you could see this. I have heard him say at conferences, so I'm not giving away anything that he hasn't said before, but those last couple of numbers on the bottom, CU Boulder is roughly double that. However, the Princeton rankings came out yesterday, and we are now 7th. We have dropped down to 7th for reefer madness, from 1st to 4th to 7th. So, yay. And anybody here from Ithaca? First, I'm sorry. All right, physical health concerns. So number one health impact, the potential harm to the developing brain in adolescence. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. There's probably most of you have heard this in other forums. If you want more information, just come up and ask me. A big part of this is based on this study that was done in New Zealand. But in our community, when they started messaging on this, after marijuana was legalized and before it was implemented, the legal recreational, and we were trying to implement local policy or educate local policymakers about what this might mean. That number one bullet there about an average decrease in IQ of 8 points, we had people comparing that to lead paint. Before lead paint was outlawed and children were eating lead paint off of chipped paint in buildings or from toys, what it was showing was an average decrease in IQ of 7 points. So this is roughly equivalent. And 8 points is, it may sound like 8 points, it's a huge percentage in decline when you look at the IQ tables. It's not a drop of 8%, it's a drop of much more than that. More on the effects of marijuana use in puberty and adolescence. Cardiovascular and cerebrovascular effects. This, I think, was a big surprise to everybody. A lot of this research is, there's a study out of France that looked at this, and it's very concerning because there are people who appear to be otherwise young and pretty healthy, and they're having these inexplicable heart attacks. And so this is what they're finding in that green box over there on the right in terms of this association. And I heard in the last few months they were talking about somebody who's in pop culture, I can't remember, was a musician or an actor or whatever, and they talked about him being found dead of a heart attack in his hotel room, and there was marijuana there. Nobody ever commented on the fact that there might be a link. But in fact, this 40-something male, it may well have been that he had the heart attack because he had used marijuana in the last hour. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to impute that, but it's one of those things that's not real well known and that needs to get out there sort of so that people are understanding that there's a connection there. Respiratory effects. Here are some of the respiratory effects. One of the things that people think marijuana is natural, right? It's a plant. Well, the way it's cultivated in Colorado, there are all kinds of pesticides and herbicides and other things being put on it. It's not like agricultural products, which are regulated by the federal government, so there isn't any sort of controls about what they're using as herbicides and pesticides. So there can be some pretty nasty stuff in the marijuana that people are consuming. Other physical effects. So this was, Don Mish came and did this presentation on marijuana to my municipal judge associations at one of our conferences, and he talked about the decreased testosterone. And somebody in our organization said, you have a hook there. You have a hook there. There are some cultures where, machismo is everything. And it's not just certain, and it's not just certain ethnic cultures. It can be any, think of your fraternity boys or some of the others. I mean, this is a possible hook for you. This is a way to use this and start messaging to people who care about that. And I mean, is that your first choice? Not necessarily, but are you going to engage a lot of people by talking about that impact? Yeah, probably so. So, you take your information where you can, and you take what's going to resonate with people and start putting that out there. Okay, other adverse health. Outcomes, again, I'm not going to linger on this one, but no surprise any of those really there. Really, the point is that this is many people who are using marijuana are risk takers, and it can be associated with other risk-taking behaviors. Is it addictive? What are the marijuana advocates going to tell you? Okay, so is it as addictive as nicotine or alcohol? No, but look at the column on the right. The numbers go much higher if you initiate use in adolescence, if you use more frequently, and for the people who are using daily, very high risk of addiction. And if you do stop using, you're going to go through cannabis withdrawal syndrome. It is a real thing. It does exist. These are some of the symptoms. And comparable to those of tobacco withdrawal. So anybody who's fought the battle of quitting smoking and knows how difficult that is, we're talking about something of the same scale. And along those lines, so this is Denver area hospitals where people were discharged with cannabis abuse or cannabis dependence in the top 3 diagnosis codes for those of you who are looking at hospital data. Again, you can see that this has gone up dramatically. This is separated out again, pre-legalization, 01 to 09 is marijuana medical only. 2010 to 2013 rates start going up even more with the era of commercialization, and then 2014 where we actually have legalization. And these rates hold true for hospitals in other parts of the state, Larimer County, down in Pueblo, some of the mountain communities. So how dangerous is marijuana? Less dangerous than alcohol overall, but it does pose risks under certain circumstances. Okay, overdose and accidental ingestion. But first we need to talk about edibles because this is pretty much occurring with people using edibles. This slide I couldn't change because I got it from Sarah Urfer at Chemitox in Boulder. This is whole blood concentrations, not wild blood concentrations, whole blood concentrations of THC. So the blue line there is when you smoke marijuana. This is kind of what everybody expects if that's what they've been using. You're going to have this pretty quick high, it's going to be very high, and then it's going to be over pretty quickly. Edibles, it's a completely different experience. It's that red line there. It takes a long time for you to feel the maximum impact. And what happens is because people aren't feeling what they expect to feel, they take one dose and they don't feel anything, and so then they take another dose and they don't feel anything, and they take another dose, and all of a sudden, wham, it hits them. And that's when the bad things happen. The peak concentration is 2 hours afterwards. If you're unfamiliar with this, most people end up just in kind of a stupor, and maybe a pretty kind of paranoid stupor, but unfortunately for some people there have been some much more serious outcomes. The other thing is that, and the other thing that's really concerning about edibles is a lot of our people who don't use marijuana at all, or are using it for the first time, or using it for the first time in a long time, a lot of our marijuana tourists, they're buying the edibles and not the weed version. And part of the reason is because most hotels are non-smoking, so they're buying something that doesn't have to be smoked. And then they're buying something that they're not familiar with, and it looks appealing. And even if it comes in sort of a pill-looking bottle, once you open it up, it looks kind of like a little gummy candy or something like that. And so we have this bad mix of delayed onset, high THC, and naive users. So before the regulations, when everything was when things are now in pill bottles, which just happened earlier this year, this is what it looked like. It was very easy for children to accidentally ingest it. Not only was it easy, it was attractive. Adults could accidentally ingest it, and we have a fair number of pets that were eating brownies or cookies or whatever that were kept around and ingesting it accidentally. The other problem was there was absolutely, right, no standardization of THC content in edibles. So one item might have 10 milligrams, another one might have 100 milligrams. If you bought a whole brownie or whole cookie, nobody knew that you should really only take an eighth to get the dose that you were looking for and would frequently eat the whole thing, so there were no instructions on use. So what happened? So this is Poison and Drug Center marijuana exposure calls, again, separated by the time medical marijuana is legalized, come over to, they started it at 2009, medical marijuana commercialized. So 2010, you see a fairly significant bump. And then in 2014, the last bar, that's when retail marijuana is legalized. And you see a huge increase in the number of those calls. So a couple of, at the end, one of my slides is resources, and there are three main resources for information from the state of Colorado. One is the Department of Public Health, and this is where this slide and a couple of the next ones are from. One is from the Department of Revenue, which is responsible for regulating marijuana, and they're going to have information about number of plants, number of outlets, amount of money made, and so forth. And the other one is from the Rocky Mountain, I'm going to say this wrong, High Enforcement Drug Trafficking Association, which is not exactly what it is. But those are three sources. They're available online. They're really going to give you a look at what's happening in our state. So this one is rates of hospitalization emergency department visits with possible marijuana exposures, children up to 9 years of age. So this was chosen by the Department of Public Health to represent accidental ingestion and overdose. So they don't assume that because you're 10 years old, you accidentally used marijuana. This is where they feel like they can get the purest version of accidental ingestion and overdose. And so these are the rates of hospitalization. Again, has increased dramatically with medical marijuana and even more dramatically with retail marijuana. If you look at retail, you note that that's only for the first half of 2014. The information's not been updated yet. Similar outcomes with patients 9 and older. This is picked by the Department of Public Health to represent intentional and unintentional overuse by adolescents and adults. So marijuana visits were second only to alcohol in terms of toxicity due to substance use. And for some of our teen populations, it's actually ahead of alcohol, some of the graphs that I've seen. And again, January to June is 6 months data in that column over there on the far right. Okay, I mentioned pets accidentally ingesting. So these are some of the symptoms that you might see in your pet, and veterinarian cases have increased pretty dramatically. So it's becoming commonplace. I had a case in my court where the dog had accidentally ingested marijuana, not once, but twice. So the dog's name, anybody want to make a guess as to what the dog's name was? Hazed. So after that, we required the animal to get monthly vet checks. And to their credit, the owners, they probably didn't stop using marijuana, but they at least started storing it more appropriately so their pet couldn't get into it. And then finally, marijuana doesn't kill. And I'm sure that you have heard about these deaths because every time one of them happens, it makes national news. But 3 deaths are linked to marijuana overdose. So number 1 is the young man there on the left. He was a student at a college in Wyoming, 19 years old, came down with some friends to Denver for the weekend. He ate a marijuana cookie or brownie, and the situation that I described earlier where he didn't immediately feel the effects and kept eating more and more, and he became very paranoid, and he ended up leaping from the hotel balcony to his death. Young man on the bottom, 23 years old, was from Texas on spring break. This happened very close to the MAPS conference that I was at here for earlier. He was there with his family from Texas. He had the pill bottle, so he had it in the newer container with a description about how to use it. Nevertheless, he wasn't feeling the effects, so he started eating more. He became very, very paranoid, and his family brought a gun with them for their personal protection, and he took the gun and he killed himself. And then the third person, Christine Kirk, 44 years old, her husband took marijuana candy along with his prescription drugs, started hallucinating. She called 911. She locked herself in the bathroom, but they didn't get there quickly enough, and he shot her, leaving her 3 children without a mother and him in prison awaiting trial. So it's not, have there been how many deaths from alcohol in that same time frame? Obviously, many, many more. But it's not as benign and as the marijuana advocates want you to think. All right, marijuana and driving. So probably at this point, a lot of people are familiar with this study, but basically alcohol contribution crashes held steady from 99 to 2010. So some really good work being done on that regard. However, fatal car crashes involving marijuana use tripled in that same time frame. The effects on driving, it does increase your risk of a motor vehicle accident. Everybody sort of thinks, well, marijuana isn't like alcohol. People don't get like all hyped up and go faster and speed, and that's true. Oftentimes their reaction times are slowed and they're traveling more slowly and so forth, but that still creates issues that's unfortunate out there on the road. There's this study of airline pilot performance, and the interesting thing about this is that the pilots just did not understand, they were not aware at all that their performance was impaired. So that's the other problem, is even if you are conscious that you have taken marijuana or used marijuana, you may not recognize that there is impairment. So the number of blood tests, these are 2 different labs that test blood, but it's, so really you're looking at the overall number. But blood tests confirmed THC in Colorado over the last few years, and you can see that big increase. And again, the big increase really begins with marijuana, medical marijuana commercialization and the ease of access, and did not happen all of a sudden in 2014 with marijuana legalization, retail marijuana legalization. All right, THC and alcohol. People have long suspected this. This is the first time I saw information on it, was when Sarah came to one of our judges' conference and spoke with us. The synergistic effect of alcohol and marijuana is going to cause impairment much more quickly than you might imagine. So for those of you who are not necessarily familiar with BAC standards for drunk driving, in Colorado at least, if you have a BAC of 0.05, you are presumed to be impaired, and you can be charged with driving while your ability is impaired. If your BAC is 0.08 or higher, and I think that's a national standard, then you're assumed to be driving under the influence of alcohol. So you can have what is a legal level of alcohol on board, 0.035. For some people that might be just 2 drinks, and a low dose of marijuana, and you have the same level of impairment as somebody who is under the influence for purposes of any state. So it's very, very concerning, and I think that people are just not aware of that additive or synergistic effect. Not sure which it is, but suggests that it's synergistic. All right, mental health impacts. I talked about adolescent use as being the #1 health impact. I would say that this is #2. And one of webinars that I attended on marijuana, the person there was really predicting that this may be the what lung cancer was to tobacco, the mental health crises that sort of emerge, or I mean, I think of them as potential crises with marijuana use that are not anticipated, and it's going to become better understood only with time. But first of all, I want to talk about psychosis. This is the definition of psychosis over here on the left, with apologies to people who are have degrees in this field. I was trying to get this fairly simplified. Much of the evidence about marijuana and mental health impacts involves psychosis. Part of the reason that's easy to identify, and therefore you can study it. I want to make sure that everybody understands, though, that it can occur as part of a mental health condition or completely independent of it. So it's not unusual for people with some of those mental health disorders listed there to present with psychosis. Does it mean that it was induced by marijuana? No. People may have it completely independent of that. At the same time, and there can even be medical conditions why you might have psychosis. But one of the things that we're seeing with marijuana is acute psychosis, meaning it occurs very quickly after ingestion of the marijuana. They don't have a pre-existing mental health condition or latent mental health condition. They don't have a medical condition. It is simply the marijuana that is causing the psychosis, independent of other conditions. So let's talk about a couple of studies. So this is a really pretty interesting study that was published earlier this year. There were some researchers in the UK that studied comparison groups from people in South London. And they picked South London because it had one of the highest recorded incidence rates of psychosis in the UK. And they took two groups of people. And the people in the first group are in that middle column. And they were people who were in an inpatient unit after having presented with their first episode of psychosis, not a subsequent, just their first one. Then they took a control group and compared them, and they selected them and screened them very carefully. And these were people who had never had a psychotic disorder or episode or illness. And they were able to try to match them as closely as possible in terms of some of their features around using marijuana and not using marijuana. What you'll see here, when you see people who have no marijuana use, they don't really show up in the table. The people who lifetime marijuana use, those percentages below it are going to add up to that 67 or 63%. They're not going to add up to 100% because because that's how they did their calculations. The biggest difference, and I grant you there are other differences, but the biggest difference, if you look at these two columns, is in whether they're using low THC marijuana or high THC marijuana. And so, and when I say low THC versus high THC, the mean content in the UK study was 16.2%. The mean in Colorado's legal environment, remember, right now is 18.7%. So this is what they found. If you began use, these are the risk factors. You begin use at under 15, you're 1.5 times more likely to present with a psychotic episode or disorder. A daily marijuana user is 3 times more likely. If you're using the high THC version only on the weekend, you're also 3 times more likely. And for those using the high TH daily, 5 times more likely. So they are not saying that this represents causation. They're very careful to say that they are not. But they said if you did assume causation, then 19.3% of those disorders would be attributable to daily marijuana use and 24% to high THC marijuana use. This is from another study, and this was information that was presented by Dr. Paula Riggs at the Department of Psychiatry at the medical school at the University of Colorado. And so I'm going to do my best to translate what I learned from her presentation. But this is looking at one gene, and if you remember sort of from basic genetics, you get one from each parent, and you're a BB for brown, or you're a B little b for brown blue on your eyes or whatever. Anyway, so this is a gene that can shows a predisposition towards schizophrenia or schizophrenia type illness. If you happen to have the version on the left, marijuana use probably isn't going to do anything negative to that. However, if you have one of the other combinations, and particularly if you have that val-val combination on the right, adolescent cannabis use is going to increase your risk of that presenting or activating by a very high percentage. So the way she explained it is you might have, if you think of a graph, and this axis is your pre-existing vulnerability to a mental illness that involves or that can include psychosis, and this is your marijuana use. If you have a very high pre-existing vulnerability and you use just a tiny bit of marijuana, it may not activate, but it may only take a tiny little bit more than it will activate. So this is really not very well understood. There's another study that involves a different genotype, but this is what's emerging. And I will tell you that I think anecdotally this is what I'm hearing in our community at least, that this seems to be confirming that. The other thing is that adolescent use also increases the risk of depression, anxiety, panic attacks, as well as conduct and behavior problems. Oh, yikes. Okay, so I don't know what happened with this slide here, but I want to talk about, so hopefully I will have this for you on the version that goes up on the website. There is new research. There was a study in the Journal of Affective Disorders by Dr. Marwaha. He did a meta-analysis of 6 research articles with almost 24 individuals with pre-existing bipolar disorder. This new research suggests that marijuana is causing manic symptoms in those with bipolar disorder. So causing onset of a new manic episode with people who have bipolar disorder. It is associated with a 3-fold increase of that risk. It also may worsen the severity and or the duration of manic phases for people with bipolar disorder. So this really underscores the importance of discouraging marijuana use among those with bipolar disorder. I will tell you that at CU Boulder, we are definitely seeing this. I'm experiencing it in court with my cases. The Office of Student Conduct is often seeing these students. And so I'm not sure how many of them are showing up at Wardenburg, but clearly something that is being confirmed out there in our environment and not just in the research. And I apologize about that. I went through this last night, but obviously something glitched. Marijuana and schizophrenia. There's been more research on this. It is associated with an increased risk of developing schizophrenia to a degree consistent with what many people are willing to call a causal relationship. One study estimates that 13% of schizophrenia cases could be averted if marijuana use was prevented. And again, the risk factors are definitely the same as what you're seeing. Early use, frequent use, high THC use. And like bipolar, it can worsen the symptoms. Marijuana and other mental illnesses, depression, suicidal thoughts or suicide attempts, anxiety disorder, and panic attacks. This is really concerning when you think about the fact that a lot of people are actually using marijuana because they think it alleviates anxiety, because they think it alleviates panic attacks, and that's not well understood by this young adult population. And I tried to have that conversation occasionally with people in court, and they just look at me like I do not know a thing. All right, additional implications for colleges and universities. So it may be legal in your state, but it's still illegal under federal law. We still have the Drug-Free Schools and Community Acts. So Colorado campuses are not allowing it on their campuses. And as far as I know, none of the Colorado institutions are accepting marijuana research dollars because of that. Something students don't typically know is if you have a marijuana conviction, you can lose your federal student financial aid. There's that question on the FAFSA. Now, there are all kinds of workarounds. If you come to court and you do a court-approved substance use treatment class, then you can report that as a no, and that's what's happening in most cases, but there is that potential. And of course, it's right after alcohol in terms of abuse. Top 10 endorsed marijuana consequences. You're probably familiar with these. Learning. So this is a really interesting study that I just came across preparing for this conference. This is sort of a natural study that happened in the Netherlands. So up until October 21st of 2011, which is that vertical line, the one that's on the left, any students attending the university in Maastricht in the Netherlands could access marijuana at what we know are the Dutch coffee shops. For some reason, the city made it illegal for students of certain nationalities to access legal cannabis from October 2011 through April 2012. And I don't know how they picked who could and couldn't use. Maybe some students were more problematic. But the students who could legally access it were from the Netherlands, from Germany, and from Belgium. So the solid line on the graph represents that population. I'm sorry, the dotted line on there represents that population. Then the solid line is students from all other countries. France, you know those French, they're troublemakers. Anyway, this gave them the opportunity to look at their academic performance in situations where some of them had access to the legal marijuana and some did not. And while they tracked pretty closely before the prohibition went into effect, the academic performance of the kids who couldn't have legal access increased substantially during that prohibition period. So you can see that that top line, that solid line, is a lot higher than the dotted line. And furthermore, the performance gains were larger for courses that required numerical or mathematical skills. So then they get to the next vertical line, and that represents a short time when the cannabis shops went on strike for 6 weeks, and they did that to protest a proposed weed pass that was going to come into effect. And so for 6 weeks, no students had access to legal marijuana, and then all of a sudden their performances become much more equivalent. So if anybody had a question about marijuana's ability to affect learning outcomes, all you need to do is look at this study, which I think is pretty interesting. So these are some of the specific impacts on learning. This is one of Don's slides. You cannot stop using it just a couple of days before your test and expect that it's going to be out of your system and you're going to be just fine. And it's really unclear how long the deficits last. Other impacts. So what we've seen in our community is the 18 to 20-year-old students, some of them who arrive here, the first thing they do is they go to Boulder, they go and get their medical marijuana card so that they can use marijuana legally, because it's illegal for them to use recreational marijuana in that age group, but they can use it medicinally. People who come and can't use it on campus, they're using outside in the community nearby. And so that's illegal public consumption, even if they're nearby in their parked cars. And then the heightened scrutiny when traveling out of state. So one of the things that you all, if you're not from Nebraska or Kansas or Oklahoma or one of our border states, there's a huge level of enforcement going on in states adjacent to Colorado. And they are clearly targeting cars with Colorado plates. And you can't pull somebody over just because they have Colorado plates. That would be illegal. But if they have a traffic violation or something, they can pull them over. And if they develop probable cause to think that you have drugs in your car, they can ask to search it. And so that's happening a lot. And the first indication that might cause them to sort of start watching your car is the Colorado plate. But I would argue even students from out of state who might have that CU Boulder Buffalo sticker on their window might be targeted. And it's people are getting stopped all the time, and they're ending up, if they do find it, they're ending up in jails. What happens depends to some degree on the amount, but it's a huge thing that we try to warn our students about so that they understand that. They even have amnesty drop boxes at the airports so that when you go, before you leave, oh, I forgot, I have my marijuana with me. You can dump it in the amnesty drop box, the Aspen airport, the Denver airport, and not have to worry about getting in trouble for it. Impacts for your resources. So we have students that ask to live off campus. We require our freshmen to live on campus unless they're living at home, but if they have a medical marijuana card, they can't use it on the campus, so they're asking for an exemption. Increased student conduct violations and/or local law violations. To be honest, we have not had, other than the underage use of marijuana, I can't say that we've had an increase in court cases resulting from marijuana use. I have never seen a single nuisance party case where they talk about everybody there was smoking marijuana. Alcohol, yes, marijuana, no. I have not seen a single underage marijuana use case that has involved somebody becoming obstructive or resistive with a police officer. So it's very, very, very rare that I see a marijuana case where there's been a transport to the hospital. So while there may be the violations, the impact of the violations on the community is relatively low. And then, of course, you need to respond with the appropriate treatment. More on mental health. This is from a study that was done at Brown University. But again, the concern is the number of students with mental illness that are also abusing cannabis, and the likelihood that that's going to cause medical leave for that population. And once again, the link between bipolar and cannabis use disorder. So what are your challenges on your campuses? Number one, the challenge that it's just pot. Again, it's natural, you know, people's perception of pot as your parents' pot, that it's less dangerous than alcohol. The fact that your parents are maybe not as disapproving of marijuana use as they are, that depends, I guess, on your local environment. And the marijuana industry, of course. Here's some recommendations. These are, again, Don Mish's slides, but always later and less. Real education, not anything that's a scare tactic. And other interventions. One of the things that Don would stress if he were here is that parents still matter in college. People seem to think that, you know, parents don't matter, the kids are away from them for the first time, they're kind of, but they are still listening. And even just weekly contact in the world of alcohol, for instance, weekly contact with your students just before the weekend often will help reduce the amount of alcohol that they drink over the weekend. It could very well be that that would be true for marijuana as well.